I'm joined today by Lisa Rhodes, the holiday property coach. Thanks so much for taking the time today.
Good morning, and very nice to be with you this morning.
My pleasure. As always, the theme of this show, we want to know how people got into the short-term rental industry, where you grew up and what you wanted to be when you were a young person.
Okay, so I had a very nomadic childhood. I was born into a military family. I was born in Hanover in Germany. With my father being in the British Army, we travelled around a lot. I had a lot of different homes through my childhood. And because of that, I actually ended up going to boarding school for most of my education from the age of 11 in the UK.
Okay.
Because that was going to give me the stability that I wouldn't have got having moved around a lot, every few years with the army.
For how long did you live in Hanover?
I started off, I was born in Munster. I was born in Hanover, I was living in Munster.
Okay.
And then we lived in Hona, in Hona for a little while.
Okay.
And then we lived in Wolfenbüttel. So we were kind of in the sort of Westphalia area for a lot of my younger years. I'm still very fond of that area. I've been back since. I think it's I feel a very big affinity to Germany, actually. I feel very settled in Germany when I visit Germany. I have a lot of German friends. So until I was about 7 or 8, I think I lived in Germany. And then various locations in the UK, and Northern Ireland was where I lived during the big troubles in Northern Ireland.
Okay.
I was there during the Omar bomb. I walked past the Omar bomb, very sadly, which created quite a lot of tense times for my family, living in Northern Ireland during the trouble years. And then eventually my family settled in Kent, and then finally in Suffolk. So when I started my working life, I was living in Suffolk.
All this traveling around, did that give you kind of an idea what you might want to be later on in life?
Well, I remember my first flight. I think I was about 7 years old, and I definitely had this ideal that being an air hostess was a very glamorous job because they had these glamorous uniforms and they travelled all over the world. So my very first career aspiration was to be an air hostess. I didn't realise at the time, how hard these people work and the hours that they fly and the insomnia and the rest of it. But I thought it was a very glamorous job, and I think travel was kind of in my bones from a very young age. Actually, I travelled a lot as my parents. We take holidays all around Europe. We used to drive all over Europe for our holidays. So travel was definitely something I could see myself doing from a very young age.
Okay. There was no intent to kind of go into this. This was more of an innocent.
I kind of looked at it and I kind of thought, well, maybe not. I mean, I always had this thing about sort of Virgin Airways and flying with Richard Branson's, business, because I always admired him as a business owner. Yeah. But no, I actually didn't seriously pursue it because logistically, trying to settle down with a career when you are the child of a nomadic military family is quite difficult, hence the boarding school education right through to my sort of further education. And then I actually married somebody in the military, something I said I would never do. I actually married them. So I ended up being a spouse to a military partner. Okay. So again, my adult life was very much impacted by the fact that I had to follow the career path of my spouse.
And then what was kind of your first steps into a professional career?
I actually was a commercial manager for a number of years. That's my first career was actually civil servant. When I was younger, I was a civil servant. So I kind of said to you, I started as a civil servant. I went from civil servant to CEO, which is quite true because as a nomadic family, I worked for the civil service. I worked for the Ministry of Defence, and I also worked for the Foreign Commonwealth Office in Saudi Arabia. I was a diplomat for a number of years, based in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, doing export promotion to the Middle East, helping to cement relationships at a very high level between Saudi Arabian business partners and British companies. So I did that for 3 years based in Riyadh, and then when I came back from Saudi Arabia, I went back into private sector, and I was a commercial director in the telecoms and technology space. I did that for about 4 or 5 years, and that kind of was a very good grounding, working in the private sector, having worked in the public sector for a couple of years. But I still felt there was something more, and I felt like I was working really hard for somebody else's business, and I was being very successful for somebody else's business, but actually it was redundancy that was the pivotal catalyst that made me realise that it was time for me to start my own business.
The necessity grew the opportunity. You call yourself a connector, and I see kind of with your background with traveling around and kind of being in this kind of ambassador type role that you always were in contact with many people, different cultures. and then the telco, like communication, I think that kind of possibly provided the ground to your career in creating this kind of connector network and being this person.
For sure. Even from a very young age, you know, when you're traveling independently from the age of 11, traveling internationally to get home to your parents wherever they happen to be living, or, you know, whether you're traveling as a spouse, you're always meeting people, and I find people absolutely fascinating. I'm not shy to go and say hello to people, and I think I mentioned that in the chapter in the book I've just written in, which is connecting with people is a very valuable attribute to be able to do, because you meet so many interesting, fascinating people and opportunities, actually collaboration opportunities, business opportunities, by just talking to people.
There's also something I read the other day with all the new technology. Every second article seems to be about AI at the moment, and I read about young people studying for jobs that won't be there once they get into a career, and that people should kind of train on problem solving, teamwork, and kind of connecting on a social level, because that's something that kind of computers and robots will never be able to do. Well, not in our lifetime. So you were ahead of your time to a certain extent.
Well, I think you either like people or you don't. My spouse actually prefers, you know, tech, and like he's quite a loner. He doesn't like lots of people having had a military career. Whereas I'm the complete opposite, and I find people absolutely fascinating, and I could sit and talk to people all day and listen to their stories. And I have met so many interesting people on my travels. When I've travelled, just by sitting next to somebody and them starting to talk to you, you find out so much. So I think those skills were something that my father cemented in us. My father ended up sort of leaving the military, and he started his first business, which was where I saw my first insight into an entrepreneurial family life, when my father started a business post his military career. He cemented some of those skills in us, you know, people skills, communication skills, organizational skills, project management skills, all those sorts of things. I definitely picked up some of those from my father.
What was the business that he founded?
So he had a Snap-on Tools franchise, which is an American company, and very, very, very popular within racing teams, you know, driving racing teams, and was incredibly successful with that business.
You mentioned that you went into unemployment for a moment and then decided to do your own thing. Tell me about this a little bit more.
Redundancy was one of the first catalysts. I actually was then headhunted into another company where I met my first business partner. I was never really unemployed, but I recognised that I was becoming fairly unhappy about the constraints of working in somebody else's business. The company I was headhunted into were a company in Bristol. They were a technology company. I was headhunted to set up the collaboration partnership, international collaboration partnerships, because again, use my skills in terms of connecting people. And there I met somebody called Michelle Stark, who became my first business partner in my first company, which was a marketing agency. We both felt that we had skills that were very complementary, and so we decided to leave our employment in that particular company and start our first marketing agency, which was aimed at SME technology companies that didn't have an in-house marketing team. So that was my first business. But going back a step, I had been investing in property since I was 22. My father said to me, get into the property business young. You know, you may be cash strapped, but you will invest in something that will always make you money. So I had started investing in property from the age of 22, even though I did buy-to-let, traditional buy-to-let. So when I met Michelle and we started our marketing agency, I then reignited my diversification of my property investment portfolio. And I suppose you'd call it an inspection trip, a sort of a go and have a look trip in Cyprus, was what started the next stage in my next business, which was the business I started in Cyprus, because I started investing in off-plan properties in Cyprus, and they were specifically short-term rental properties. So I had this marketing agency in the UK, which was doing very well. We were flying, the business was very successful, but I was still kind of looking at this, well, what's my next? You know, I need another something next. And it just so happened to be these off-plan properties that I bought in Cyprus were my next step into my next business.
What year are we talking about now?
So this is 2003. 2003 is when I started buying these off-plan properties in Cyprus. They were apartments, they were holiday apartments, they were in an area that was not yet established. It was quite an emerging market in Cyprus at the time, but I know it was very much an emerging market in Cyprus. I specifically identified areas that I felt would have potential in the future. The market was not there yet, but I could see that it would be there in a couple of years' time.
No one nudged you in that direction. You felt this is a good direction to go into.
Yeah, I had looked at the UK market. The UK market was quite expensive at the time. I wanted my investment funds to go a bit further. I was willing to kind of go a bit further afield to find that next investment. And yeah, I found that in Cyprus. I could get more for my money off plan in Cyprus at the time than I could in the UK. So rather than invest all my money in more buy-to-lets in the UK, I decided to diversify my portfolio and invest it in property in Cyprus.
That was for a long time your main focus as a career, if I understand that correctly.
Yeah, it was. It was unexpected, actually. It wasn't a plan as such. It was that when my properties were completed, I recognised that there really wasn't the infrastructure and the services locally established to provide the services that, as an investor owner, I was going to need. Again, as an entrepreneur, I saw a gap in the market, and I decided, well, if those services don't exist for me, there are thousands of other investors who are buying in this emerging market that are going to need these services, just like me. So, in addition to the company I was running with my partner in the UK, I decided to start a full service in Cyprus at the same time because I needed those services myself for my properties, and because I was becoming quite well known over there by what I was dealing with the other investors. I started that service very small with, sort of, you take your completed off-plan property and it needs inspecting, it needs a builder's, post-build inspection, it needed styling and interior designing, and it needed furnishing at the very first part of the journey.
Sure.
And so that's what I started with. I started with that service. It was called an Investor Complete service, and it was like, you don't want to come and do this, I will do it for you. I will take that off your hands and I'll do that for you. And then I layered onto that the management of the property, because of course you then needed someone to look after it for you, the key holding, the servicing, the managing of it. And then the third section of my planned service delivery was the rental marketing, because I recognised that you've got property that's now furnished, ready to go, you've got it managed, but the owners needed it to rent for it to earn its keep. Sure. And so with my marketing experience, I then layered on the third stage of the service, which was the full service, which was to market the properties to get them rented, because if they weren't renting, they were not going to be of any value to anybody really. They were not going to, earn their keep. And that's how I did it.
If you're not with the feet on the ground to start a team, I can see this now today. I work in a team that's mostly remote, and I think it's a big challenge when you have to manage a team that you don't see every day face to face. You don't see if they're switched on, if they are motivated, if they're not. You just have little windows. And also the initial hiring process, I can imagine, is quite tricky. How did that work for you?
I think it comes back to my relationship building. While I had been looking for support for my own properties, I'd started forming relationships on the ground with local suppliers, furniture suppliers, and in actual fact, there were definitely gaps in some of those services and some of the things I had to source in the UK. So, for example, I tried buying furniture packages. They didn't exist in Cyprus. There were no IKEAs. There were no large department stores at the time. There was very limited choice, and I didn't want properties to be poorly furnished. And so, again, with my entrepreneurial hat on, I decided to come back to the UK, source all the furniture that I needed, and I wanted them all to be different. I wanted to work with the owners to make sure that we were delivering schemes and styling that was going to be right for the market, for the ideal client that we were going to be targeting. And I started buying that and shipping it all to Cyprus and getting it through customs and delivering it, project managing it. I'd go over to Cyprus, project manage the delivery, get them installed, and everything would be done. In the same way in Cyprus, building these relationships took time, but initially what I did was I worked with local contractors. So I didn't directly employ people immediately. I worked with contractors that I needed on a flexible basis, so I could increase and decrease my resourcing as I needed it. And then when I had an established base of properties and the inventory was growing, I then recognised I now needed to have a more established team, and I would start recruiting locally people and training people locally to deliver the services that we then needed for a more established inventory of properties. At each stage of our growth, I planned to increase my team on an employed basis rather than a contractor basis.
What was your property count at its peak?
175 properties. They were spread across the island. So the island of Cyprus is quite an interesting island. Of course, most people know it's split between the Turkish side and the Cypriot side, so we were only able to operate on the Cypriot side. You can't operate on both.
Yeah.
And I started in the Paphos area of the island, which is where I actually had my own properties, and I kind of organically grew by word of mouth. I didn't ever advertise our services. I organically grew by networking, by people knowing what we were doing, by people trusting, and building that trust actually was where we grew our business organically. Interestingly, on the ground, a lot of companies were very aggressive towards each other in terms of their competitiveness and I actually stayed out of all of that because I just grew organically, quietly, through trust and building relationships. And 175 properties. So I think the last point of our growth was sort of towards the Larnaca, Napa end of the island. So we started at one end of the island and we organically grew across the island.
That's for every software company in the vacation rental industry. The client, when they hear 175 properties, every salesperson goes like, I want to get my hands in there. What technology did you use, and what changes in technology did you see from growing from your first property to the 175?
Well, it's funny, because I was laughing. I was talking to Mark Simpson when we were at the Short Stay Summit saying, actually we started marketing before a lot of the OTA platforms even existed. So we were dealing with direct bookings. We were dealing with relationship building. So I reached out to sort of travel agency companies and, some level of social media was available. But, it was about building those relationships so people could refer clients to you. And we had our own website built. And I used, at the time, the choice of property management technology, that market was not mature as it is now. The choices of technology that we could use was limited. So I actually had some technology built that was kind of a bit, probably started in a more traditional estate agency type platform, and we had to have it kind of, I'm going to say, fudged, to work for what we needed, because other things that came up, well, I was working in dual currency, until Cyprus joined the EU, we were dual currency, we were the Cyprus pounds and the pound sterling, and then we had the euro and pound sterling. I had clients based all over the world that, we were definitely operating in, because the business was a UK based business, but we were operating with a satellite business in Cyprus. There were all those kinds of things that companies don't necessarily realise they're going to have to deal with if they are operating in different countries. Fluctuating currency exchange rates for kind of clients sending money to us for things, there were all those things that we had to deal with. So your technology had to cope with that. And at the time, there was very little available that was going to do it, to be honest. So I had to work with a company to kind of fudge a product that was available and make it work for us.
We talked about, before the call, a little bit about the challenges of running a business when you don't have the feet on the ground. What was the biggest challenge or the biggest roadblock that you ran into while building this business in Cyprus?
I would say, people management is without doubt one of the biggest challenges of running a satellite business, because you are only as good as your team on the ground. And that required a big commitment to, team training and systems and processes. So I was always very good at systems and processes and making sure that everybody understood what those systems and processes were. So the quality of the delivery of our service was very much dependent on everybody understanding their role in our systems and processes for delivery of a very high quality service to a lot of properties, a lot of landlord owners and a lot of guests. I would say that was something we had to get really sorted out. Our foundations to the success of our business was very much about really good, strong systems and operating processes and good people. And the one thing I found certainly in the expatriate community is that, people do move around quite a lot. So consistency and continuity of staff is quite tricky when people's lives change and they come and go. So there was quite a lot of that. And especially in high season, when you really need your team on the ground, you have to be agile enough to cope with, and in any business, changes to your team for whatever reason, personal reasons, sickness reasons, whatever. And in a short-term rental business, it is 7 days a week. You can't get away from it. You are renting all year round. The season in Cyprus ran from sort of late February right through to late November, and often through the winter. So we didn't have kind of a lot of downtime through the year. Our properties would be busy all year round. So, you had to have rotational flexibility in your resourcing to cope with that, really, because that was always going to be a challenge. And in terms of the biggest challenges I had in Cyprus, I think I mentioned to you, one was that our business bank, the Laiki Bank, went under. That happened quite quickly, and it took the government of Cyprus quite a long time to step in and take action to then transfer all the clients from that bank to the Bank of Cyprus. But in that window of about 6 to 8 weeks, nobody could draw any money out. Nobody could move any money in and out of the country. You couldn't pay anybody. You know, they started limiting. I think you could draw out something like, I don't know, 100 euros a week or something ridiculous like that. It was a huge, huge business challenge trying to manage cash flow and payments and contract payments and all that sort of thing while you didn't have access to your business money. Thankfully, I always kept money out of Cyprus in the UK, so I had another way around things. I had to find another worker way around. But those companies that were only in Cyprus, they were really stuck if they were relying solely on that bank, because their money was frozen in the bank for quite a long time. Yeah, that was quite a challenge.
I had this actually with my property the other day. Guests do seem to enjoy electricity, weirdly enough, and you ran into some issues there in Cyprus.
Yes, we did. When there's a situation that you can't possibly have planned for in insurance terms, so even insurance won't cover it.
Like an act of God.
So there was a very, very big explosion very close to the single largest electricity supply station in Cyprus, caused by the incorrect storage of some weapons that had been confiscated from a Russian tanker some years before, and they had been, for whatever reason, stored very closely to the single largest electricity station in Cyprus. And these things went off, and it was a major disaster. And not only did it sadly kill a lot of people, you know, at the power station, fire crews trying to deal with it, and people driving on the motorway, it then took out the entire island's electricity supply for a long time. It took them, I think, about a week to get a secondary intermittent service established to supply the island. So even after a week, I think we were down to the odd hour in a day of electricity sporadically, and it took them about 2 months to get any kind of regular supply in place. So of course, when you've got 175 holiday properties in the peak of the season and they're all occupied, what do you do when you suddenly don't have any electricity? And your guest answer is, you know, I'm on holiday and I want electricity, and you need to sort it out. And you just have to say, you know, and we basically put a position in place where we contacted every single guest immediately, as quickly as we could, either by calling around to see them or dropping a note under the door to say, this is what's happened. This is completely unexpected and out of our hands. And these are the options, you know. And they would say, well, move me into a hotel. I'm saying, well, the hotels are in no better position. They don't have electricity either. I don't have any electricity in my own home. I happen to have been in the island at the time, actually. So I was experiencing it firsthand, just like everybody else was. Most guests were incredibly understanding and patient, and for those that really couldn't cope with it, they had the option of kind of dealing with their travel insurance companies if they would cover them, or they decided to cut short their holiday and fly home. But you know, most guests were incredibly patient and very grateful that we were as proactive as we were to at least communicate with them what the options were and what we could and couldn't do, what we couldn't expect at the time. And as we found out things, we would communicate to our guests what was happening.
I'm on a couple of host forums and I see, oh, we have this situation, the cooker broke, electricity went out, what am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to give a discount to my guests? I think it's always about managing expectations and communication and making sure that the guests know what's going on, how long it's supposed to take. That, I think, is the most important part. When guests feel like, okay, we know what we're in and what are my options. And like you said, do I want to cut my holiday short? There's someone who understands the situation and not feeling left alone. Just throwing money at a problem, that's not the ideal solution.
But then we all feel that, you know, so when we're stuck in an airline queue and the flight is delayed, and the biggest criticism is when they don't tell you what's going on. They don't tell you how it's likely to affect you for. It's the not knowing. I mean, not knowing good news is not great, but not knowing anything at all is just a vacuum of information that just leads to people getting upset. Now,
you are no longer with the Cyprus property management.
No. In just before the pandemic, and with Brexit coming in to good old Great Britain, things I knew were going to change, and they were going to be more complicated in terms of the legals and the financials. that I realised that, you know, it was time for me to do something else. And my biggest concern at the time to rehome my business was my client relationships. You know, a lot of clients have stayed with us for the 18 years I ran that business, and we were incredibly respectful of those relationships, very grateful for those relationships, and it was important to me that I rehome that business with somebody that was going to really look after them and continue. And I found that in somebody that was part of my team in Cyprus, who were established and living on the island, knew all the properties. So in 2021, during the middle of the pandemic, we finally completed the transition of that business to a new owner, and I basically supported them for about 15 months to make sure everybody was happy. And I gave myself some time out actually for about 6 months, because I hadn't done that for a long time. I'd worked really long hours, long days for many, many years. Yeah. So during the pandemic, I took six months out and did a bit of what I call reinvesting in me time, you know, redeveloping myself, preparing my skills for what I plan to be my next business, which is the business I'm doing now, which is primarily sitting in the online space and coaching other people to scale and manage their own property portfolio or property management company in the way that I did. So yeah, I started that business in 2022 actually.
Which is, after COVID, possibly really good timing, because there's so many people who got into it and then realized that it's not as easy as it looked from the outside. You mentioned you wrote a book which has just been published.
I did, and that was again a very unexpected event, because it wasn't something that was on my horizon at all. You know, I wanted to be able to just get on with my business and just carries on doing what I do. And you're right, people often think that what we do looks really easy from the outside, and a lot of the clients I'm now working with are those clients that perhaps started during the pandemic and are now finding things a little bit difficult. But one of the things I did was I restocked my connections during the pandemic, and one of those decisions was to join a membership group called Peaks Private Members, which was a private online membership because they couldn't do in-person meetings at the time, primarily for women. It's now a mixed group, and through meeting a lot of amazing entrepreneurs through joining that membership, I got to meet a number of people, and we decided that we all had a lot of value in our knowledge and our experience that we should be sharing with people. And so the collaboration of this book, Fearless Connections, came about because we felt that we often don't share that knowledge. We know it, but we forget we know as much as we do. And perhaps there is a way of paying it forward and sharing that knowledge with other people who are thinking about going into business or perhaps new in business, to recognise that sometimes this journey is a bit of a roller coaster. It's not an easy journey. You know, sometimes people do make it look really easy. We don't necessarily share the difficult stuff. We just get on with the job. So that's why this book came about, and the book launched yesterday. And I'm pleased to say it's doing really well. It's now #1 in 3 business categories.
So congratulations. Very good. Very good. This is today. Where's Lisa Rhodes in the near or semi-distant future? What are other projects that you can imagine doing? Or is it now all about consulting and kind of giving back and sharing your experiences?
Yeah, so there's definitely a bit of me that says, you know, I no longer want to work the 7 days a week, 24/7, be on call, be available to a business that I had. The holiday property coach business really is about kind of having a better balance, a better life-work balance. That means working with a smaller number of clients and really adding some value to their business and helping them to overcome the growth pains that all businesses are going to go through. I think economically things are quite difficult at the moment, so it's about positioning themselves, it's about being visible, it's about being different and unique and standing out, and it's also about being profitable. And quite tricky, I think, for people at the moment. How do you remain profitable when you've got such massive overheads and, you know, everything's changing so quickly? So that's where my focus for the clients I'm working with is now. Personally, I'm very much up for saying yes to a lot of things I couldn't say yes to in the past because I was so tied to the business, and some of that is about doing some more travel. So for example, I'm going to take a month to travel around Indonesia in October, November, something I've wanted to do for a long time, and I'm going to do things that I probably haven't done. You know, I haven't done some spontaneous things for a while, so there's going to be a bit of saying yes to doing things I haven't done for a while.
Yeah, because the whole kind of being in tourism and hospitality, for us it's still work. And for people, it's like, it's a cool industry to be in. You're not traveling as much as you think you do.
The digital nomad is great, isn't it? But, you know, the reality is that if you're running a business, your business has to take some level of priority with whatever you try and slot in with it, doesn't it?
It does. It does. Anyone who's interested in growing their business, feel free to reach out to Lisa, check out her new book. Lisa, it's been great fun listening to your journey. Thanks so much for taking time.
Thank you.
And looking forward to see you at one of the next events.
I very much hope to bump into you again at another event, Flo. It's been great chatting to you. Thank you very much for the invitation.
My pleasure.